And Ben and Claire, you're on.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So Ben Copeland's here with the Water Investment Division. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we applied the cost rates that Claire has put together to put together the formula grant targets and funding levels.
Hi, all. Thanks for being here. My name is Claire Madden. I'm the Tracking and Accounting Supervisor for the Clean Water Initiative Program in the Water Investment Division. And I'm going to get us started with the presentation today. Ready for the next slide when you are, Ben?
Yep.
Here's an overview of what we plan to cover in the presentation portion. Like Chris said, we're going to keep the presentation to just about half of the hour, if not a little bit less, and then have time for a public comment. So we'll go through a brief reintroduction to the high-level key elements of the Clean Water Service Delivery Act, or Act 76, that are relevant to today's conversation. We'll review the revisions that have been made to the cost rate methodology, and then Ben will share updates to the target setting and fund allocations that will be applied to the fiscal year 26 Water Quality Restoration Formula Grant Awards, and also discuss the retroactive adjustment of previously assigned targets. We'll provide a final slide with some details on how to submit written public comments, and then move into the public comment period. So just starting from the beginning, overall, Vermont has a lot of really exceptional water resources that support all kinds of use and enjoyment. And it's a priority of the state to protect and enhance high quality waters, as well as restore water quality where it is not meeting state standards. And a foundational piece to the state's approach to water quality restoration and protection is Vermont's Clean Water Act, or Act 64 of 2015, which set into place the key regulatory and financial frameworks to support Vermont's work to restore water quality in degraded systems, and includes a particular focus on addressing non-point sources of pollution and sources of nutrient impairments in our water bodies. We're here today to focus on a piece of Act 76, which was passed in 2019 to build off of Act 64. And one of the primary things that Act 76 did was to restructure the administration and implementation of clean water funds in the state. It established 4 new complementary grant programs that provide an expanded financial mechanism to achieve both regulatory requirements to address water quality challenges and also non-regulatory actions to address water quality. The focus for today is one of those 4 grant programs, the Water Quality Restoration Formula Grants. Formula grants use a formulaic distribution of funding to achieve phosphorus reduction targets in the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog basins, where the state has water quality restoration plans, or total maximum daily loads, TMDLs for short, that outline the amount of phosphorus reduction necessary to restore these water bodies to meeting state water quality standards. Act 76 required the establishment of clean water service providers to administer water quality restoration formula grants. The Clean Water Service Providers, or CWISPs, were established by rule in 2021. The Act also identified CWISPs as responsible for administering funds in partnership with their basin water quality councils to oversee the identification, prioritization, development, implementation, and maintenance of projects in order to meet assigned phosphorus reduction targets. CWISP's phosphorus reduction targets are meant to address non-regulatory activities that are required to meet the phosphorus reduction goals under the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog TMDL. And this is just an excerpt from the Act, the statutory reference for that prompts the cost rate methodology. Water quality restoration formula grants are award levels are made based on a pollution reduction goal that's informed by the TMDL reduction target at the basin level and a standard cost rate. So the purpose of the cost rate is to use that standard cost rate to determine by formula how to allocate budgeted funds and at what level to assign phosphorus reduction targets for the CWISPs to achieve. The first cost rate was published in June of 2022. And since then, we've made 3 annual formula grant awards to the clean water service providers. We've seen good indications of progress building in the system, and we've also learned a lot and identified some key areas for improvement. So the updates that we've made to the cost rate have been informed by stakeholder feedback. Many of you here today have provided us really valuable feedback that has helped to inform the updates we've made. This has come from clean water service providers, but also from the project implementer network and funding program administrators who are interacting with formula grants and other complementary initiatives statewide. The primary areas of focus for the updates to the cost rate included increasing the sample size to include more project data, normalizing all project dollars to account for inflation by adjusting with the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. We tried to simplify the approach to calculating the project level cost rate where that was possible, removing assumptions and inferences everywhere that we could to get a more direct dollars spent per unit of phosphorus reduced. And we revised the approach to our sector-based cost rates, where in the previous cost rate we used a straight average. We are now implementing a weighted average. I'll get into more details on those in just a minute. Before we do that, just a reminder of where we are in the process. We have completed the updated data analysis to inform revised cost rates. Those were drafted into the updated cost rate and fund allocation methodology, which was posted for type 3 public notice, a 30-day notice period on September 17th. And we're here today holding the public meeting. Public comments are due back to DEC by October 18th, after which we'll prepare a responsiveness summary and finalize the cost rate and fund allocation methodology to apply to the state fiscal year 2026 formula grant awards. Right. So this slide provides a high-level sort of stepwise overview of the methodology used to calculate the cost rates. There's a lot more detail on the individual cost rates available in the document posted for public comment. So if you're interested, definitely encourage folks to dive in there. The first step was compiling all of the data that's been reported to DEC on projects completed through the end of state fiscal year 2024. We reviewed that data set and removed any projects that were non-representative or not suitable for analysis. That we then applied the inflation adjustment. So all project level costs have been adjusted to January 2025 dollars using CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, and then broke up the project data set into project category level data sets. So that means we completed this analysis for stormwater treatment practices, separate from riparian buffer planting, separate from dam removals and other floodplain restoration projects, acknowledging that all of these project types have different costs and different pollution reduction potentials. The next step in the process was to apply an assumed design and engineering cost to the implementation cost data that we have available. So for every project type where some level of design or engineering is required in order to complete the project, we assumed that is 20% of the cost to implement the project. This applies to every project type included in the analysis except riparian buffer plantings, which generally require very little engineering. Then we'll get into the details later of how we addressed some other pieces in the project pipeline, like identification, development, and operation and maintenance costs. Those were not included in the cost rate step. For each project in the project category sample, we then calculated the project level cost rate. So dividing the total CPI adjusted cost, including assumed design costs, by the annual rate of estimated phosphorus reduction in kilograms per year to get a cost per unit of annual pollution reduction. And in some cases, in as many cases as we could, we used project data directly from our database. In some cases, we needed to apply some assumptions or fill information gaps where we had missing information. So that was applied to the cost assumption for bioengineered lake shoreline stabilization, which was informed by consultation with DEC's Lakes and Ponds program. And then for the phosphorus accounting, we used assumptions in place of actual estimated phosphorus reductions for a couple of project types where the phosphorus accounting methodologies are relatively new compared to our data set. So we don't have a complete data set of estimated phosphorus reductions for floodplain and stream restoration, forest roads, private roads, or lake shoreline stabilization. From the project category unit costs, we then calculated the median cost rate for the project category. So we used a median rather than a mean to reduce the potential impact of outliers and decrease the effect of noise in the data set. And this results in a relatively representative median cost per unit of annual phosphorus reduction by project type. The last step, step 7 on the screen there, is to correlate project category cost rates to the TMDL sector loading that the project type treats. So correlating a project like a riparian buffer planting to treating loading from the agricultural sector, and correlating a floodplain stream restoration project type to treating the stream load in the TMDL. The end product of the cost rate analysis is a standard median representative cost per unit of annual phosphorus reduction by sector. The reason that we correlate project category cost rates to sectors is to help with the next step that Ben's going to cover in assessing the phosphorus reduction targets and funding allocation, correlating those to the TMDL sector-based load reduction requirements. Project category cost levels vary quite a bit. Some project categories also have a wider or narrow range of variance within the project category. And it's really important to note that we can't only do the least expensive actions to reach the TMDL, the overall TMDL goals. So Vermont has taken an all-in approach to our clean water planning and restoration efforts, and that includes implementing some combination of all of these strategies in order to reach our pollution reduction goals. It also is worth noting that the list of project category cost rates included here for the purpose of setting sector-based cost rates are not an exhaustive list of the project types that can be implemented under the formula grant program. We chose this subset of project category cost rates as representative and possible to tie directly to treating phosphorus loading from one of the TMDL land use sectors. In the agriculture and forest sector, you can see there's a single project category cost rate that is representative of the median cost to treat a unit of phosphorus coming from that land use sector. In the streams and developed land sector, we've chosen more than one representative project category cost rate, and we've applied a weighting schema to come up with the sector-based cost rate. The weighting schema is determined in part looking at the data of past proportions of implementation, and also in the developed land sector specifically, considering the currently available and expected near future available tools and assessment protocols, and the proportion of project implementation opportunities that fall into each of those project categories. With that, I'll pass it to Ben.
Great. Thanks, Claire. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how we apply the revised cost rates to set formula grant targets and funding levels for each clean water service provider. So I'm going to discuss how formula grant funding levels and targets have been set based on the non-regulatory reduction targets for each basin, multiplying that by the cost rates, and then scaling that to the available funding levels to set targets and funding levels for each clean water service provider. So the basis for formula grant targets are the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog TMDL reduction targets that have been set for each basin by clean water sector. And so we've estimated the level of phosphorus reductions we expect to be achieved through regulatory programs and subtracted that from the total reductions required to calculate the non-regulatory load reduction targets that would be applied for each clean water service provider. So I'm just going to walk through how this has worked out for each of the sectors. So in the agricultural sector, we estimated that 90% of the load reductions would come from regulatory programs or best management practice implementation funded through state and federal programs, which leaves 10% of the agricultural target for clean water service providers. On the stream sector, we estimated 2/3 of the reductions coming through regulatory programs in the river sector, leaving 33% of the targets for clean water service providers. And then in the forest sector, it gets a little more complicated. So for most of the basins, we expect that the revised acceptable management practices will allow us to meet the load reduction targets for those basins, which was 5%. But for the South Lake Champlain Basin and for the Missisquoi Basin, we had larger reduction targets of 40 and 50%, which means that for those two basins, roughly 90% of the load reductions would be tied into non-regulatory targets. So those would be provided to the clean water service providers. So this analysis hasn't changed from our last cost rate methodology for those three sectors. So the numbers are exactly the same in this updated cost rate methodology for those three sectors. We have made some minor changes in the developed land sector. So in the developed lands, it's a little more complicated. We've actually estimated the reductions across 4 different permitting programs. So that's the municipal road general permit, our so-called 3-acre permit, the MS4 permit, and TS4 permit that addresses our state transportation infrastructure. And we've actually only made some minor adjustments to the MS4 permit program. We had a couple of communities that we didn't have phosphorus reduction estimates through that permit program, and we've since gotten those numbers, so we've added those additional regulatory reductions. But that's only made a pretty small change in the non-regulatory reduction targets for the clean water service providers. So generally, we're kind of starting from almost the identical starting point from our last cost rate methodology when it comes to the targets for clean water service providers. And so the next step in the process was to take those non-regulatory reductions and actually multiply that for each of these clean water service providers by the sector cost rate that Claire had established here. And that estimates the total cost to achieve non-regulatory reductions just for the design and engineering and implementation of those projects. And then the other thing you have to consider is that we have a time frame for implementing the TMDL. So we've adjusted this based on the implementation time frame, so dividing by the number of years that we have to implement the TMDL. And then we've also added in 10% for project identification and development costs that we don't have phosphorus associated with that. We've added in some funding for ongoing operations and maintenance, and then 15% administrative cost for each of the clean water service providers. So we've added this all together. We come up with a total funding required across the system to meet our clean water reduction goals. But as folks probably know, we don't have that much funding available. And so we've had to scale the targets and funding levels based on the funding levels that are available. And so we've essentially reduced the funding and targets to 3.4% of what we identified as needed for all of the basins. And then for 3 of our basins, this resulted in a funding level that was less than $700,000. And because we feel like $700,000 is roughly the minimum to have a sustainable clean water service provider functioning with the Basin Water Quality Council, we've adjusted the minimum funding level for the South or the North Champlain Basin, the Lamoille, and the Memphremagog basins up to the minimum funding level of $700,000, along with the targets that go along with that. And that's required us to reduce both the funding and the targets across the other 4 basins to total up with the funding we have available. So kind of going through all of this math, this is the final table of what the targets and funding levels are for each of the clean water service providers. So the total annual phosphorus reductions are about 216 kilograms. You can see there's a pretty wide range across the different basin water quality councils, from a low of about 15 kilograms for the Lamoille to almost 80 kilograms per year for the Missisquoi Basin. And you can see it's not identical for each of these basins in terms of the level of funding versus the target. Some of these basins have more phosphorus associated with the agricultural sector, so they may have a little bit higher target relative to their funding level. And others, like the Lamoille, have high levels of funding targeted towards the developed land sector. And so they have a little bit lower target relative to the funding level. And so we're proposing these targets and funding levels for the state fiscal year 2026 funding. But we're also, because of the magnitude of the changes in the cost rate methodology, and many of these changes would have also impacted the previous targets, we've gone back and revised the previous targets based on these new cost rates. And so we've done that simply by taking off all of the actual operation and maintenance costs that clean water service providers have invoiced for over the last 3 years. We've removed the 10% funding for ID and development that doesn't have phosphorus tied into it. And then we've simply taken the remaining development or design and implementation funding and broken that out based on the new cost rates. And so this essentially means that we've cut those targets back. It hasn't been the same across the board. So those basins that have higher levels of developed lands have seen a larger reduction because we've seen a larger increase in those stormwater costs versus some of the other basins that have more of the agricultural reductions in their target, and those basins have seen a little bit smaller of a reduction in those previous awards. So just wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about some of the implications for formula grants. So this is a graph here that shows the projects that have been, or the potential phosphorus reduction of projects that clean water service providers have funded. And this is based on the quarter that they were funded at the Basin Water Quality Council. And so in green are the projects that have been funded for implementation and have closed out at this point in time. So a little over 100 kilograms of projects that I would call in the bank at this point. So those projects have been completed and closed out. We have another over 400 kilograms of phosphorus reduction potential for projects that are actively being implemented at this time. And then quite a few projects in the preliminary and final design phases. So altogether, if all of those projects are fully implemented, we'd expect almost 1,600 kilograms of phosphorus reduction as those projects move through. And so we know there's some uncertainty of those projects at the preliminary and final design phase. Not all of those will move forward with the estimated phosphorus reductions. But I think the point here is just that we've been making, that clean water service providers, Basin Water Quality Councils, and project implementers have been making significant progress under these grants. And they've supported over 150 projects through the existing cost rate methodology. So we expect to happen with this revised cost rate methodology is that it will increase the flexibility for clean water service providers and Basin Water Quality Councils to support a broader diversity of projects. So it will make it more feasible to support some of those stormwater projects that are a little more expensive. And we expect that this will shift the dynamic at our Basin Water Quality Councils, where right now we're seeing that there's more funding that's available than projects. And so essentially projects that meet a minimum threshold are getting supported. But as more projects are developed, and there's a lot of work right now that our project implementers and folks out in the landscape are doing to develop those projects, as we see more projects come in, we expect that there'll be more projects than funding, and then prioritization will take a larger role. And one of the primary prioritization criteria is the cost efficiency. And so we do expect that there'll be more competition as more projects come in, and as we're seeing more competitive rounds of funding coming to Basin Water Quality Councils. And so finally, I just want to emphasize that we've taken the best data that we have available for this cost rate methodology update, but there is a fair amount of uncertainty in a lot of the work that we've done here. And so we know that the potential mix of projects that clean water service providers are going to implement is not going to match exactly what we've included in this cost rate methodology. We also know that there may be some new project types that are developed. There could be revisions to our phosphorus efficiencies for different projects. There's opportunities for clean water service providers to do leveraging and adoption of projects. And then we have ongoing uncertainty around inflation and other factors. So I think from my perspective, we've come up with a good framework for pulling together these targets for clean water service providers and funding levels. But we know these don't reflect what's actually going to happen on the ground. There's going to be a lot of factors that we just can't control for. And so we certainly welcome some comment from all of you today if we've missed some information or if there's some things we could improve on. But I also know that at some point you get to a point of diminishing returns and you can only get so accurate with all the uncertainty that's out there in the system. And so that's I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so I'll take over facilitation if you want. Thank you, Claire and Ben. That's fantastic. Just a reminder that we are in a formal type 3 notice. So we have an awkward dynamic where we're supposed to take your comments and respond to them in a formal way, with written responses. You can submit comments formally through the written process, but if you have comments now, you can make them known, or if you have clarifying questions that you think we might be able to answer, we can hear your question and see if we can answer it within the scope of this meeting. And if there's folks online who have questions or comments, you can raise your hand if you want to, or there's also somebody here in the room. We're just going to hang and see if anybody, and if there's no comments, like, we certainly prefer comments in written form because it's easier for us to respond to those and manage them, but up to you. This meeting is for you. Oh, I see Jared waving his hand. Hi, Jared.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for putting this together. I just wanted to say that I don't have any questions at this time. Might have one or two, but I intend on filing comments at some point on October 17th or before October 17th. But may actually also tie them into the clean water budget together. So yes, something will be filed, but no comments at this time. Just wanted to let you know. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Jared. Thanks for being here. We look forward to seeing your comments. Well, I'll sit here for another minute or two in awkward silence, and then if there's no comments, we will adjourn the meeting.
This slides down so we can see if anybody else is.
Chris,
Oh, yeah.
I've got a question for Ben. This is Shane.
Great. Hi, Shane.
Ben, could you walk through that last slide a little bit? I was just looking at the increase. Yeah, can you just walk through it? Like, I'm seeing things like the implementation closeout is flat, but the implementation active is like everything else is climbing, but the closeout's flat. Like, can you just explain what's going on with this slide a little bit?
Yeah, so let me explain exactly what this is showing. And so this is the reporting that our clean water service providers are doing. And this is through the end of the state 2025 state fiscal year. And essentially what I've done here is for the projects that have closed out, we've taken what's actually in our database for the phosphorus reduction for those projects. But the reason that flattens out is it takes roughly 2 years to implement a project and close it out. So essentially, this is tied into when those projects were funded. So we're seeing that going up for those first number of quarters as those projects have closed out more recently. But for the last year and a half, any project that was funded for implementation probably hasn't closed out yet. So those projects are just still in the active status. So it's a little bit confusing in terms of that distinction between what's active and versus closed out. So I do expect that as this goes over time, there's going to always be that flat portion of the closed out piece because it takes a while to get a project into the ground and closed out.
All right, so that's just representing the lag time between funding and actual closeout. And then, so with the steep climb and preliminary designs, is that a good indication that implementation closeout line is going to jump up as well?
Yeah, so the way I look at this is like there's higher levels of uncertainty as you move up this graph. So we're pretty confident about the projects that are in the implementation phase that are actively being implemented, but we may see some adjustments in the actual phosphorus reductions for those implementation projects that are still actively being done, because you might get a couple more acres here, or you might get a little bit less here, but when you get to the actual implementation phase before it closes out. And then when you're at the final design phase, you may see some significant changes during that process, but you generally have a pretty good idea of what you're going to do for that project. And then at the preliminary design, this is the estimated phosphorus reduction at the beginning of that preliminary design phase. So there's a fair amount of uncertainty around what you're actually going to get for some of those phosphorus reductions for some of those preliminary designs. And then there's a potential that a few of those will hit roadblocks and might not move forward towards implementation. So, again, I wouldn't say that there's 1,600 kilograms that we're necessarily going to get from this suite of projects. So I think that number will likely go down to some degree because of some of those changes that may happen across the different design phases. But what I did do from this is, if a project was funded for design and then funded for implementation, we remove those projects from this graph, so we're not double counting any of those projects that have been funded through multiple phases.
Okay, great, thanks.
Well, I'm going to sit here one more minute and we'll see if there's any comments. Any comments from you, Meg? No comments from you. Dean Pierce.
Yeah, Chris, I won't let there be dead air. I will say, but I don't want to hold you up too much, but you reserved the room, right? After all, I will just say that I know this stuff is really complicated, and I want to thank everybody who was involved with putting this new proposal together, because I can imagine that it was a lot of work. We in Quisp Lands and WIC Lands have wanted to see the project costs updated for a while now, so we're now getting closer to that. So I think that's a good thing. I was also a little bit involved when the first round was set up, and it's made understanding this new proposal a little bit easier for me than if I was starting from scratch, but it's still complicated. I'm trying to get my head around it, and I'm continuing to mark up the document. I also wanted to say that I appreciate the comments that maybe Ben or someone made about how the new methodology could change the dynamic if it's adopted. And I agree with that. I think it was an important thing to say, because I'm not sure everyone will necessarily see it that way, just based on limited data. I think some will see this as almost like more money, that lowering targets and somehow means more money, and that things will somehow be easier. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. But anyway, I just wanted to say that I appreciate the comment, but I also am saying that, there may need to be some education if we truly believe that the dynamic is going to change in that way, about explaining why it's going to change in that way. And maybe me sticking my neck out will encourage some other Quisp folks to say a few words as well.
Well, Dean, for the record, I took notes on what you said, but it would be, it seems like it's a general overarching statement. So if you would like a formal response from us, I'd encourage you to submit something for us to comment on in writing. Not necessary. That's you.
Yeah, I'm not worried about any response to what I said today. Okay. We're submitting written comments later.
Great, thank you.
And I'm trying to lower my hand, but I don't think I can.
I can do it for you. I feel like an auctioneer. Going once. Going twice. I appreciate that we've been able to provide this analysis for you in this presentation. I know Claire and Ben have done amazing work. Dean, I recognize what you said, that this is complicated and you're appreciative of the effort. And I'm sending that back to my colleagues in the room. And yes, the public comment period is open for another week or so. So please submit comments to us through the ENB environmental notice bulletin. Should you have comments, we look forward to receiving them. And with that, I think I'm going to close the meeting. Going once, going twice, 3 times. Thank you all for attending. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I stopped recording. Do I just leave?
Oh, that's right. There we go.